Hello and welcome back to the channel and another new PGA Tour 2K25 design tutorial. And with this one, we're going to be focusing on bunkers and everything to do with those, which have had a massive upgrade in the new game. We're going to be looking at the new high-res bunker sculpting, how you can affect all of the lip controls that you can do to make your bunkers really pop, and look at all sorts of different types of bunkers from, say, Heathland to Sandbelt to terrain painted bunkers, and when you might want to use each of them, as well as some tips for making them look as good as you possibly can do. We'll also look at a little bit of playability around bunkers, and finally going to talk a bit more about that high-res terrain system and how you can leverage that as best you can. Enjoy! So the first thing we're going to look at is your bunker settings, and as you can see, we've got some new textures at the end that you can play around with. You've also got the usual things of firmness, roll, and then this high-res bunker stamping is new. If you want, you can just turn those off, and then all bunkers look exactly the same as they used to in 23. But why would you want to do that when they're so much better here? These are the base stats, and we're going to play around with these and show you how they work. So you've got base depth, essentially how low in the ground the bunker will sit. These are all global settings. They affect all of your bunkers. You then have the lip depth, i.e. how much that comes down, and start and steepness. And we'll show you how each of those work. Now, the first thing is you're probably going to want to do less sculpting in the bunker and more kind of around it. So if we find a hollow where this would sit pretty naturally, that's going to be a good place to start. And once we put it in, you can see actually it does a pretty good job of sculpting it. Force settings and then bunkers. You can see we can now play around with some of this stuff. So if we were going to increase the depth, if they added that or not, let's say we went significantly deeper, you can see that a lot of the sculpting work is kind of done for you. You can get them to be properly bathtubby if you want, where they all sink down, which can work quite nicely for pots. You could also set it to dead flat, which I know some people will be excited about, and we're going to look at those types of bunkers later as well. In terms of the lip depth, well, as you can see from here, what that changes is basically how much it sinks at this point before it starts going inwards. So you can create a very steep lip, or you can basically have it doing next to nothing. You've then got the lip start. Clear if you go for 0, then actually it kind of doesn't start until a long way away. This can be very useful for some of those die-styled grass face bunkers. Or you can go up to, let's say, 100, in which case you get these weird sandy indentations that, frankly, I don't know what you'd use. And lastly, you've got your lip steepness. This is up by pretty high at default. So that's essentially how sharply that comes down. If we go to 0, it's very smooth. What it means is you have to do generally less sculpting in the bunkers. I'm finding that I'm doing way less inside the bunkers than I've ever done and far more around the outside. As ever, you can still chain different bunker shapes together. The high-res terrain does mean that it can be a little bit harder to get the super fine shapes. And now one thing you are still going to want to do with bunkers is where those brushes don't perfectly overline, you are going to want to paint a little bit more. And you'll see that this drops down a little bit further because, as with the old game, if brushes don't overlap perfectly, it might show as bunker texture, but it doesn't necessarily play exactly as, or show it on the terrain mesh as much as it could do. The only additional thing, as we mentioned, is that you can paint bunkers in with subsoil A as well, and I'll give you some examples in which we can do that. In order to do that, you're just doing, refer to the terrain painting tutorial, but you're kind of doing the same thing, just you can't get any sculpting options on these. This is what you're dealing with, and then you have to manually sculpt around it, which has kind of the cons of it's less immediately easy to use than this, but the pros that you have complete control over that. One of the types of bunkers I've been really enjoying in this game have been the ones I've been playing around with on Shell Bay Links. Now, these are, I guess, loosely inspired by some Core and Crenshaw stuff where everything gets really crumpled, but the bunker pans, like you're not flashing the sand up too much, but there's a ton of variability with it. So what you'll see immediately is the base depth is at 0. That means I can sculpt it as if it's normal land, and that fits the look I was going for more rather than looking for a sculpting workaround. Additionally, though, there is some lip depth that generates this little look. If we went to 0, you would see the difference that that makes. The lips start at 30. Again, you don't really want to do too much with that. If I'd done it at 100, it would look very, very odd. With some of these, you're just going to have to play around with them. And finally, the steepness. If I'd gone all the way up to 100, this is what they would have looked like. and I felt those were just getting off the edge of the bunker. So 83 kind of gave me that definition. The benefit of these is you can get really interesting with some of the sculpting around the lips. So the main one you want for like soft raises would be this brush, I would say. You guys have the sculpting preview, which I didn't have when building this course. So you can see how the land is going to react before you do it. A lot of click and drag, and that can end up with some pretty safe areas around these bunkers. However, one I'm preferring a lot more is this one, and just kind of spam clicking a little bit. You have to be careful with this, but it can give you some more interesting bits of definition. Now, you only want to do it at relatively low heights, so we'll do some clicking and dragging now. And generally, it's going to take a lot of playing around with until you're really comfortable with it. But what this one does, I find, is just gives you some more irregular sculpting rather than that smooth look. And for what I was going with, that worked really nice. Additionally, you can play with different bunker styles on one course. So we have some where the lips are flashing up a little bit because I thought that fitted there. We have some terrain painted ones. Don't be afraid to mix native and maintained areas. That can work pretty well as well. And we have some that are this kind of like pan style bunker as well, where they're pretty flat. At the complete other end of the spectrum, you have West Yarra, where all I have done, I have not sculpted a single bunker again, I have just changed the base depth and lips and things like that. You can see you get a much better transition off the green. The ball's going to roll down pretty nicely. They look really realistic in terms of how everything works and functions. Now, in terms of this, what we have, well, the base depth is pretty low, but then these were heavily sculpted in the initial one. So if you were doing yours from scratch, you wouldn't necessarily want to start from here. You'd play around with that. Another example of a different and very simple look that you can get is these on Coombe Point, which is a work in progress. Now, this one has some base depth bunkers of 19.7. They're quite deep, I would say, with a relatively sharp lip that starts a little bit lower into the bunker. Now, these have ended up being some of the simplest I've ever sculpted just because they're put into natural hollows. And it's a good example that if you put them in the right places with the land kind of already set, you don't need to do too much to them. The bunker tool will do the rest. One of the things I find really exciting is that now that we can do flat bottom bunkers absolutely flawlessly, and they're really easy for all. They were quite a technical nightmare for everyone back in the older games. However, these on Emery Beach have been redone from scratch, and you can see that they are perfectly flat. This absolutely has zero impact because you don't have a lip. Your lip depth is at 0, so it doesn't really make a difference. Once you've done this, the sculpting around the edges of the bunkers is all that you need to do, and we can get closer to the edges than ever. You still have to be quite technical with them. For example, if you were taking this brush and going a little too close to the edge, you will start to see that edge raise up just a touch. As mentioned in the terrain painting video, you can just terrain paint your bunkers as well, and those will have a pretty good effect. The benefit of this is really that you get these kind of grassy, roughy edges, which look, I think, really nice. Particularly from a distance, it looks good, ragged. Now, in terms of the opacity doing this, we're at 87%, so it's breaking up just a touch around the edges. One of the other benefits of this is that you can really control the intensity at which these come in. Again, you'd have seen this in the terrain painting video, but we can transition from kind of rough native area through to pristine maintained area, and it looks the same texture because it is the same texture, just at varying intensities, which is very cool. Now, additionally, I know a lot of people are very excited about the possibility of doing a Heathland course with some of these assets, and you can do the bunkering to match. In this case, they're quite deep and punishing. If you hit in these sorts of bunkers, you want to be prepared for at least a one-stroke penalty. Now, if you looked at the other style of bunkers, so this would be the Allwoodley style, you had some really flared up and raised edges, and you can get very creative with the sculpting on these. And these are some of the favourite bunkers that I've done, and will certainly be a course that I do want to come back to. I had this very early stages of the game, and there were a lot of bugs and things, so we left it go. Now, the one thing you want to be wary of with the lip being this deep, if you ended up in this bunker and this close to it, that was nigh on impossible to play out of. So 4 feet 11 and being close to it, we've got to bear in mind that that is a really strong penalty. And finally, we're going to look at Salem Creek. Now, again, this one's just a port, so this is one I updated for the new game, and therefore I was just playing around with the global setting to avoid having to do too much work, but I think they've come out pretty nicely. Now, the other thing I was going to tack on to this, the high-res bunker stamping is tied to their new terrain model, and whilst I didn't think you could make a whole tutorial about it, I did want to touch on that in this video. So what this means is basically every little bit around the greens, you will notice much more clearly the detail on sculpting. For example, you'd never been able to see these slopes here from the fairway in the old games because they weren't high enough. However, now you can see them from quite some distance away. You can see every little nuance and hump and bump. What you will find is you may want to go back over your greens because you can just see imperfections that weren't there beforehand. Therefore, it's probably worth going back over your greens and just smoothing them out and making sure that those all work a little bit better. Your green grid currently looks like this. However, last night I ended up unlocking a really cool skill in the archetype system. So I finally got my guy to level 85, and that means I now get a very high density green grid, which looks awesome. So this is it fully maxed out. This basically doubles the number of green boxes that you get, which is amazing. We have asked for this to be put into the designer as default so that you see the greens like this. What it does mean likely in practice is the 9-box rule can't really work because everybody's 9-box would be different. But it does also mean that we can see things in much finer detail and get those slopes even more where you want it to. Again, this is a product of that high-res terrain system, and it just looks fantastic. It also makes your greens look absolutely massive because your brain needs to recalibrate to them. So I'm still getting used to that one. In terms of working with the high-res terrain, I guess my advice would just be patient with your sculpting and be careful with it. You don't need to be as hard with some of the moves as you used to. And subtle sculpting still works really, really well. You can go at the same increments, but as you can see, the same tools will still apply. Everything just looks much, much better, and you can see what you're doing that little bit more. That did mean with some of the courses, you would start seeing things that you never previously could see. A great example for me was Acadia Lodge, where there's a lot of imperfections and like some of the slopes looked really severe, and you start realizing why people are struggling with some of the ghost breaks that they had because we just simply couldn't see what was going on under the hood before. So that's all the stuff really that I've discovered about bunkers since having this game, and in fact we didn't even have this high-res bunker tool until a couple of months into having the build. Now, there is still tons of stuff that people are going to learn and figure out, and that's going to be really exciting. But that coupled with the high-res terrain just means that the courses look properly next-gen, which is great. There's loads of creativity that you can do with them. I think bunkers, additionally with them now being hazards, as well as now looking great, you're going to be able to do a lot more stuff than you previously were able to. And with this high-res green grid as well, I think that brings a lot of cool stuff into play too, for both designers and players. There's just a load of quality of life updates that are really good. Hopefully you've enjoyed this tutorial. See you next time.